The northern wilderness was supposed to erase her existence, a rejected Omega, cast out by her own pack, left to die in a collapsing cabin where even hope froze under endless snow. She had nothing left, except a starving white wolf pup she fed every single day, even when her own body begged for survival. But the world made one mistake. It watched her, kindness, and called it weakness. Until the night, the forest went completely silent. 4 colossal black wolves emerged from the blizzard, moving like royal executioners born from ancient war. They did not attack. They bowed, not to an alpha, not to a king, but to the forgotten woman everyone discarded. And the pup she saved was not just a pup. It was the last heir of a bloodline erased from history. Now every kingdom is waking up. Every alpha is hunting her. And the Alpha King himself has arrived with one command: return the heir, or watch the world collapse into war. So the question is, was she ever truly rejected? Or was she chosen for something the world was never meant to survive? A violent snowstorm swallowed the northern wilderness beneath a curtain of white, erasing roads, forests, and even the distant mountains that once guarded the border of the northern pack. The frozen wind howled across the empty valley with such force that even the oldest pine trees bent beneath its weight. Hidden among those endless sheets of snow stood a lonely wooden cabin, leaning slightly to one side after years of neglect. Its roof was patched with uneven planks, its walls scarred by countless winters, and its chimney struggled to release a thin trail of smoke into the storm. No warrior guarded the cabin. No banner marked its owner. It was the kind of place where forgotten people disappeared, and where the world expected them to remain unseen forever. Inside that small cabin, Ara wrapped a worn blanket tightly around her shoulders while staring into a nearly empty clay bowl resting on the rough wooden table. A handful of dried roots, 2 small pieces of stale bread, and the last spoonful of stew remained. It was not enough to survive another day, yet she never looked at the food with hunger. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the small window where snow continued to pile against the walls. She waited patiently, ignoring the weakness spreading through her body, as though someone far more important than herself would soon arrive. The waiting ended with a faint scratching sound beneath the broken porch. Despite the freezing cold, a gentle smile touched her tired face for the first time that day. She pulled on her worn boots, wrapped herself in an old gray cloak, and stepped into the blizzard. The icy wind immediately cut across her skin like hundreds of tiny blades, but she barely reacted. She carefully knelt beside the porch and lifted a loose wooden board that hid a narrow space beneath the cabin. Curled inside was a tiny white wolf pup. Its ribs were visible beneath its soft fur, and one of its paws still carried an old scar that had never fully healed. The little creature raised its head the moment it sensed her presence. Even through its weakness, its bright silver eyes carried an unusual intelligence that never seemed to belong to an ordinary wolf. Ara quietly broke the last piece of bread into smaller portions before placing them in front of the pup. She ignored the painful growl of her own empty stomach as the tiny wolf eagerly began eating. While it finished every crumb, she gently brushed snow away from its ears and checked the healing wound on its paw. She had repeated this simple routine every day for nearly 2 months, never expecting anything in return. To the rest of the world, feeding a starving animal while starving herself would have seemed foolish. To Ara, it was the only reminder that kindness had not completely disappeared from her life. Far beyond the cabin, inside the towering stone fortress of the northern pack, warmth and celebration filled the enormous great hall. Massive fires burned inside carved fireplaces while warriors enjoyed overflowing tables covered with roasted meat and fresh bread. Silver goblets reflected dancing flames as laughter echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. No one spoke Ara's name with sympathy. When they remembered her at all, it was only as an example of disgrace. Months earlier, she had stood proudly among them as an Omega healer respected for her quiet dedication and unwavering loyalty. She had never challenged an alpha, never sought power, and never betrayed her duties. Yet a single accusation had shattered everything. Ancient healing herbs had vanished from the royal stores during the harshest winter in decades. Before anyone searched for the truth, ambitious nobles had already chosen someone to blame. An Omega without powerful relatives offered the perfect sacrifice. False witnesses appeared. Invented evidence spread through the council. Fear replaced reason. Within a single afternoon, her reputation disappeared. The pack stripped away her title. They seized her small home. They marked her as cursed. Even the Alpha, who had once promised to protect every member of his pack, lowered his eyes instead of defending her. No chains had been necessary. Rejection alone had destroyed her life. The exile that followed proved even crueler than the accusation itself. She had been escorted beyond the frozen borders, carrying only a blanket, a few supplies, and enough food to survive less than a week. The abandoned cabin had become both her prison and her shelter. Every morning she expected the wilderness to claim another piece of her strength. Instead, she discovered the injured wolf pup lying beneath a fallen pine tree after a violent snowstorm. It had been barely alive. Most people would have walked away. Ara carried it home. From that moment forward, every meal she found became a shared meal. Every piece of firewood warmed them both. Every lonely evening felt slightly less empty because another heartbeat existed beneath the same fragile roof. As winter deepened, strange things slowly began. Changing around the cabin, the traps she carefully placed often contained fresh rabbits. Even when she had not baited them, large predators that normally hunted near the valley suddenly disappeared. Sometimes, fresh animal tracks circled the cabin without ever approaching the door. They were enormous, far larger than any wolf she had ever seen. Whenever she followed them into the forest, they vanished without explanation, as though the snow itself had swallowed every clue. She tried, convincing herself that exhaustion had begun playing tricks on her mind, yet the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. One evening she climbed the small hill overlooking the frozen valley to gather dry branches before another storm arrived. The forest remained unnaturally quiet. Even birds had abandoned the sky, half buried beneath fresh snow. She noticed enormous paw prints stretching between the trees. Each print measured nearly twice the size of an ordinary wolf. The stride between them suggested incredible speed and impossible strength. Whatever had left them was unlike anything recorded in the northern pack. A chill, colder than the winter itself, settled inside her chest. She slowly looked around. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Still, she could not shake the overwhelming certainty that unseen eyes watched every step she took. She returned to the cabin before darkness swallowed the forest. That night the fire burned lower than usual. The wolf pup rested beside the hearth, sleeping peacefully despite the fierce storm. Outside, Ara stared into the dancing flames while memories she tried so hard to bury returned one after another. She remembered standing before the council while accusations rained down upon her. She remembered warriors refusing to meet her eyes. She remembered carrying every ounce of hope into the great hall, believing truth would protect her. Instead, silence had condemned her more effectively than lies ever could. For a long time, she wondered whether anger would eventually replace the pain. It never did. The wound remained, but it became quieter. The loneliness remained, but it no longer controlled her. Perhaps surviving each day had slowly become its own form of quiet strength. Just before dawn, the wolf pup suddenly lifted its head. Its ears stood alert. A low growl escaped its throat. Ara immediately turned toward the window. Beyond the frost-covered glass, shapes moved through the blizzard. One, then another, then another. The snowfall briefly parted beneath a flash of moonlight. Massive black wolves stood silently beyond the tree line. Their bodies were larger than horses. Their eyes glowed like molten silver against the darkness. None approached, None attacked. They simply watched the lonely cabin in complete silence. The tiny white pup slowly stepped toward the door. The first time since she had rescued it, the little wolf lowered its head with unmistakable respect, not toward the strangers, toward something that had not yet revealed itself. Then, every enormous black wolf bowed at exactly the same moment. Ara's heart froze. The forgotten Omega, whom the entire northern pack had abandoned, suddenly realized that whatever had just arrived in the frozen wilderness had not come to hunt. It had come looking for her. The frozen valley remained silent long after the 4 enormous black wolves lowered their heads before the lonely cabin. The wind continued to roar through the towering pines, yet none of the creatures moved. Their disciplined stillness felt unnatural, as though even the storm understood it had entered the presence of something ancient. Ara stood motionless behind the frost-covered window, unable to decide whether she was witnessing reality or another illusion born from months of loneliness. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the blizzard outside, while the small white wolf pup quietly walked toward the wooden door without showing the slightest trace of fear. The pup stopped only a few steps away from the entrance. Its silver eyes remained fixed on the silent guardians beyond the snow. Moments earlier, it had appeared weak and fragile, but now its posture carried an unexpected dignity. It no longer resembled an abandoned animal struggling to survive. For the first time since Ara had found it beneath the fallen pine tree, it looked like something born to command respect. Ara slowly opened the cabin door. A wave of freezing air rushed inside, carrying thousands of tiny snowflakes that danced around the dim firelight. The 4 black wolves did not advance. They simply remained where they stood, their powerful bodies half hidden within the swirling storm. Their glowing eyes rested not on the cabin, not on the pup, but entirely upon Ara herself. Confusion replaced fear. Nothing about the moment made sense. Every lesson she had learned during her years inside the northern pack insisted that wolves of such size and discipline belonged only to forgotten legends. They were spoken of in old stories told to young pups before winter festivals, tales about royal guardians who had vanished centuries ago along with the oldest bloodlines of the werewolf kingdoms. Those stories had always sounded impossible, yet impossible things now stood only a few steps beyond her doorway. The smallest movement came from the white pup. It walked into the snow without hesitation and stopped halfway between Ara and the 4 guardians. The blizzard wrapped around its tiny body, yet not a single snowflake seemed willing to settle upon its fur. The black wolves lowered themselves even further, until their heads nearly touched the frozen ground. Ara felt every breath leave her lungs. They were honoring the little creature she had rescued. One of the massive wolves slowly raised its head. A deep scar stretched across its left eye, while countless battle marks covered its dark coat. It carried the presence of a veteran who had survived wars capable of destroying kingdoms. Yet even such an overwhelming creature showed complete restraint. Instead of aggression, there was unmistakable loyalty. The scarred guardian released a single low sound that echoed across the valley. It was neither a growl nor a howl. It resembled an ancient signal that belonged to another age. The white pup answered with a quiet cry of its own. The forest awakened. Far beyond the trees, hidden shapes shifted through the darkness. Ara suddenly realized the 4 wolves had never arrived alone. Countless unseen protectors surrounded the valley without revealing themselves. The cabin she believed abandoned had been watched for far longer than she could ever imagine. A strange mixture of relief and uncertainty settled inside her heart. If these creatures wished to harm her, they could have done so many nights ago. Instead, they had remained hidden, observing in silence while she shared every meal with the abandoned pup. The scarred guardian finally took one careful step forward. Around its neck rested a weathered silver medallion engraved with a symbol Ara had seen only once before. Years earlier, while organizing damaged books inside the Healer archives, she had discovered an ancient illustration depicting the royal crest of the Shadow bloodline. The same crescent surrounded by intertwined branches now rested upon the Guardian's collar. Her thoughts raced. The Shadow bloodline had disappeared generations ago. Every history scroll, claimed the royal family had been exterminated during the Great Blood Purge. Their castles had burned. Their warriors had vanished, and their heirs had supposedly perished before reaching adulthood. If those stories were true, then nothing standing before her should exist. If those stories were false, then someone had hidden the greatest secret in werewolf history. The white pup slowly returned to Ara and gently pressed its head against her leg. The simple gesture carried more trust than words ever could. She instinctively rested her hand upon its soft fur. The moment she did, every black wolf lifted its head together. Respect, not for a queen, not for an alpha, for the woman who had protected the last surviving child of their fallen dynasty. Far beyond the valley, another storm gathered inside the northern pack fortress. The council hall echoed with growing frustration as hunting parties returned empty-handed for the third consecutive week. Reports described enormous wolf tracks appearing throughout the northern forests. Livestock vanished without explanation. Scouts refused to travel beyond the old border after sunset. Rumors spread faster than winter winds. Some claimed ancient spirits had returned. Others whispered that forgotten royal guardians had begun moving again. The Alpha dismissed every story as fear born from harsh weather. But several elders remained deeply unsettled. They remembered fragments of history most younger warriors had never studied. The appearance of black guardian wolves had once signaled only one event: the return of royal blood. No one dared speak those words aloud. Meanwhile, hidden beneath layers of political ambition, another danger quietly awakened. The noble family responsible for Ara's exile received an unexpected visitor before dawn. The traveler wore a dark cloak without any visible insignia. His face remained hidden beneath the hood, yet his voice carried calm certainty. The missing heir had been found. Every witness connected to the child must disappear before sunrise. No names were spoken. None were necessary. The conspirators immediately understood exactly who needed to die. Back inside the cabin, Ara noticed the scarred guardian carefully placing something upon the snow before stepping away. It was an old leather pouch sealed with faded crimson thread. After waiting several moments, she cautiously retrieved it. Inside rested a beautifully crafted pendant bearing the same royal crest she had seen around the guardian's neck. Folded beneath the pendant lay a weathered piece of parchment. Its edges had nearly crumbled with age, but one sentence remained perfectly readable. Protect the child until the guardian's return. Trust no Alpha. Ara stared at those words while countless unanswered questions flooded her mind. Who had written the message? How had it survived so many years? Why had fate chosen her instead of someone stronger? Before she could gather another thought, the white pup suddenly growled. This time the sound carried unmistakable warning. The 4 black wolves instantly turned toward the eastern forest. Every muscle in their enormous bodies tightened. Peaceful silence vanished. From somewhere beyond the frozen trees came the distant sound of horns echoing across the valley. Not one, not two, many. The hunt had begun. Someone else knew the air was alive. The echo of distant hunting horns rolled across the frozen valley like the warning cry of an ancient beast. Their sound drifted through the forest, growing louder with every passing moment until even the snow seemed to tremble beneath their call. The 4 black wolves immediately shifted their formation, placing themselves between the eastern tree line and the lonely cabin. Every movement was calm and deliberate. There was no panic, no confusion, only the disciplined precision of warriors who had prepared for this moment long before it arrived. Ara stepped outside despite the bitter cold. The white wolf pup remained close to her side, its silver eyes fixed on the forest beyond the drifting curtain of snow. The little creature no longer appeared frightened. Instead, an unfamiliar confidence radiated from its small frame, as though it understood exactly who had come searching and exactly what was now at stake. The scarred guardian slowly approached Ara before lowering his head once again. His glowing eyes met hers with quiet certainty. Although no words passed between them, The meaning became impossible to ignore. The time for hiding had ended. The secret she had unknowingly protected could no longer remain buried beneath the snow. Ara tightened her grip around the weathered leather pouch hanging from her belt. The ancient pendant hidden inside suddenly felt heavier than stone. Only hours earlier, she had believed herself to be the most forgotten woman in the northern pack. Now every heartbeat seemed connected to a mystery capable of shaking kingdoms. The hunting horns sounded again. This time they came much closer. The guardians turned toward the eastern ridge, where shadows slowly appeared between the towering pines. Figures dressed in dark winter cloaks emerged from the storm one after another. They carried long spears marked with silver blades that reflected the pale morning light. Their faces remained hidden beneath thick hoods, but their disciplined march revealed years of military training. The black wolves did not attack. Neither did the strangers. For several long moments, both sides remained completely still, while the storm swirled between them. Then something unexpected happened. The strangers suddenly noticed the scarred guardian. Without hesitation, every hunter lowered their weapons, one by one. They dropped to one knee in the snow. Ara watched in complete disbelief. These were not assassins. They were loyal warriors. An elderly man stepped forward from among them. Time had covered his beard with white, but his posture remained proud despite countless years of hardship. A faded crest rested upon his heavy cloak, the very same crescent symbol carved into the ancient pendant. His tired eyes settled upon the little white pup. For a brief moment they filled with tears. He lowered his head until it nearly touched the frozen ground. The air lives. The quiet words vanished into the wind, yet they carried enough emotion to silence everyone present. The old warrior slowly raised his gaze toward Ara. There are no words capable of repaying what you have done. His voice remained steady, though sorrow lingered beneath every syllable. For generations, we searched every kingdom believing our royal blood had been erased forever. We buried our kings. We buried our queens. We buried our hope. Yet one child survived because a woman the world abandoned refused to abandon him. Ara remained speechless. She looked down at the little wolf who gently leaned against her leg. Nothing about him had changed. He was still the frightened creature she had rescued beneath the fallen tree. Still the pup she had carried through snowstorms. Still the lonely soul who waited outside her cabin every evening only, Now she understood that destiny had been resting beside her fireplace all along. The elderly guardian carefully explained what little time allowed. Years earlier, the shadow bloodline had not been destroyed by chance. The massacre had been planned. Powerful alpha rulers feared the ancient royal family because their authority united every northern territory under laws, built upon loyalty rather than fear. Greedy leaders wanted divided kingdoms instead of united ones, so they betrayed the throne from within, allowing rival factions to eliminate nearly every member of the royal dynasty during a single terrible night. Only one newborn heir escaped, protected by loyal guardians. The child disappeared before sunrise. The survivors scattered across distant lands, swearing never to reveal the heir until the time was right. For years they searched, for years they failed, until one guardian discovered faint traces leading toward the frozen wilderness. Then, they found Ara, the old warrior's expression, darkened. Our enemies have discovered the same truth, as though summoned by those words. Another horn echoed through the valley. Unlike the first, this one sounded harsh and cruel. The scarred guardian instantly lifted his head. The wolves growled. Together, the elderly commander turned toward the western ridge. They are already here. Dark figures appeared between the trees, far more than before. Unlike the loyal guardians, these warriors carried crimson banners embroidered with black claws. Their armor gleamed beneath layers of frost while enormous battle wolves advanced beside them. Every step pushed fresh snow aside with terrifying force. At their center rode a broad-shouldered alpha whose scarred face reflected absolute confidence. His eyes swept across the valley before stopping upon the white pup. A cold smile slowly crossed his lips. He had found what he came for, the Guardian. Commander quietly signaled his warriors. Instead of preparing for battle, they formed a protective circle around Era and the heir. The decision surprised her. There were too few of them. If fighting began, they would be overwhelmed. The old commander noticed her concern. Our duty has never been victory. His weathered eyes remained fixed on the approaching enemy. Our duty has always been survival. The scarred guardian suddenly nudged Ara toward a narrow path hidden behind the cabin. Only then did she notice fresh wolf tracks leading into the dense northern forest. An escape route prepared long before today. Everything became clear. Tharsat. Guardians had never expected this valley to remain safe. Forever, they had planned for the day their enemies arrived. The white pup looked back once toward the approaching army. Something ancient awakened within his silver eyes. For the briefest moment, they glowed with brilliant golden light. Every black wolf immediately lowered its head on Ara. The elderly commander froze in astonishment. The blood remembers. His whispered words carried both hope and fear. Before anyone could react, the enemy alpha raised his hand. Hundreds of warriors surged forward through the blizzard. The Guardians answered with a single, thunderous howl that shook the frozen mountains. Themselves, Ara clutched the young heir against her chest as the scarred guardian led her toward the hidden forest path. Behind her, the first clash of steel echoed across the valley. Ahead lay only endless snow and uncertainty. She did not know where the path would lead. She only knew one terrifying truth, the forgotten. Omega no longer carried only her own life. She carried the future of an empire, and somewhere deep within the ancient forest, unseen eyes continued watching her every step, waiting for the moment when the woman once rejected by every alpha would become the greatest threat they had ever created. The valley that once felt like a forgotten edge of the world had now become a battlefield where destiny itself was being rewritten. Snow no longer fell gently. It tore through the air in violent waves as if the storm had chosen a side. The clash between the Guardians and the crimson-bannered invaders echoed across the frozen expanse, turning the silence of centuries into chaos within moments. Steel met fang, breath met roar, and the ground beneath them trembled under the weight of awakening war. Ara moved through the hidden forest path with the white wolf pup pressed tightly against her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. Behind her, the sound of battle grew distant but never disappeared. It followed her like a heartbeat she could not escape. The scarred guardian had forced her into this path with urgency she had never seen before. Yet even in the chaos, his final look had not been one of fear. It had been acceptance, as though he had already known what this moment would demand. The deeper she moved into the forest, the more unnatural the silence became. No birds, no wind between branches. Even the snow seemed to hesitate before touching the ground. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something far worse than war to arrive. The white pup suddenly lifted its head. Its small body tensed and a low growl escaped its throat. The sound was different from anything Ara had heard before. It was not fear. It was recognition. From the shadows ahead, figures emerged without sound. Not warriors this time. Not guardians. Something colder. They wore black armor etched with symbols of broken crowns, and their presence carried a pressure that made the air feel heavier. These were not soldiers born from loyalty. They were born from ambition, alpha enforcers who served kingdoms that had long abandoned honor in exchange for control. The lead figure stepped forward, his gaze locking directly onto the white pup. "There it is," he said quietly. As if confirming a long-awaited truth, Ara instinctively stepped back, but the forest behind her had already filled with movement. More figures appeared. The path was no longer an escape. It was a trap that had been waiting patiently for her arrival. The Elder Guardian's warning echoed in her memory. Trust no alpha. Now she understood why. The white pup pressed closer to her chest, and for the first time she felt its tiny body trembling. Not from weakness, but from restrained power trying to awaken too early. The lead enforcer raised his hand. Take the air. Kill everything else! The forest exploded into motion. Before Ara could even react, shadowed warriors surged forward. But the moment they crossed the invisible boundary around the pup, the world shifted. A pulse of energy erupted outward from the white wolf's body. Snow froze midair. Sound fractured. Even time itself seemed to hesitate for a single breathless second. Then the black wolves arrived. They moved like falling judgment. The scarred guardian and his remaining pack burst through the trees, colliding with the enforcers before Ara could even understand how they had followed her so quickly. The forest became a storm of motion, black against black, loyalty against greed, survival against control. Ara fell to her knees in the snow, shielding the pup instinctively as chaos unfolded around her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The path behind her had collapsed into war. The path ahead was swallowed by enemies. She was no longer escaping. She was standing at the center of something ancient and irreversible. The scarred guardian fought with brutal precision, tearing through enemies who outnumbered him with terrifying discipline. Every movement was calculated, every strike purposeful. Yet even he was being pushed back. The enforcers were not ordinary warriors. They were trained specifically to hunt guardians like him. One of the enforcers broke through the defensive line and lunged toward Ara. She froze. There was no time to react. But before the strike could land, the white pup let out a cry that shattered the air. The sound was not small, it was ancient. A shockwave erupted from its body, throwing every nearby warrior backward. Trees cracked under invisible force. Snow lifted into the sky like reversed rainfall. For a moment, the battlefield went completely still, and in that stillness, Ara saw it. The pup was changing. Its fragile form was no longer fragile. Beneath the white fur, something far older was awakening. A golden light pulsed faintly through its chest like a buried sun refusing to die. The enforcers staggered backward in disbelief. That's impossible, one of them whispered. The scarred guardian dropped to one knee despite the battle continuing around him. His voice trembled for the first time. The awakening has begun. Ara stared at the creature in her arms as if seeing it for the first time. The helpless life she had protected. The starving pup she had fed with her own hands. The companion she had believed needed saving. It was no longer something to be protected. It was something the world feared. A distant horn sounded again. Louder this time, closer, more controlled. Not chaos, command. The enemy forces suddenly stopped moving. Even the guardians hesitated. From the edge of the forest, a single rider appeared. He did not rush. He did not fight. He simply walked forward through the snow as if the battlefield belonged to him already. His armor was darker than night, and his presence carried a pressure that silenced even the storm. Every warrior, regardless of allegiance, instinctively lowered their weapons slightly. The Alpha King had arrived. His gaze moved past the chaos, past the guardians, past the enforcers. It stopped only on the white pup. A faint smile formed on his face. So you survived, he said quietly, as if speaking to history itself. Ara tightened her grip instinctively, but the Alpha King's eyes slowly shifted toward her for the first time, not with rage, not with curiosity, with recognition, as if he had been searching for her longer than she had been alive. The scarred guardian whispered a single warning, through clenched breath. If he takes the air, the world ends as we know it. The Alpha King raised his hand slightly, and every enemy, every ally, every warrior on the field froze. Again. His voice carried across the frozen valley like a final decree. The air returns with me. The white pup lifted its head one last time, and the golden light inside it finally opened. The moment the golden light fully opened within the white wolf pup, the frozen valley fell into a silence deeper than death itself. The storm that had raged for hours seemed to hesitate, as if even nature recognized the arrival of something that existed beyond war, beyond kingdoms, beyond time. The light was not violent. It was ancient. It spread softly from the pup's chest, like the slow awakening of a forgotten sun buried beneath centuries of ice. Ara could no longer feel her body clearly. The creature in her arms was no longer a fragile life she had once tried to save. Its weight had changed. Its presence had deepened. Every instinct in her mind screamed that she was holding something the world was never meant to touch. Yet her hands did not move away. Something deeper than fear anchored her in place, as if her fate had already been tied to this moment long before she ever found the pup beneath the fallen tree. The Alpha King stood at the edge of the battlefield, unmoving. The wind pulled at his dark armor, yet not a single step disturbed his stance. His gaze remained locked on the awakening air, and for the first time, the faint certainty in his expression cracked. Not into fear, not into doubt, but into memory, as though he was witnessing the completion of a prophecy that had shaped every war, every betrayal, and every rise of power across generations. The scarred guardian stepped forward despite his injuries, blood staining the snow beneath him. His voice was no longer that of a warrior, but of someone carrying the weight of an ancient oath. The shadow bloodline was never meant to rule through fear, he said, his words breaking through the frozen air. It was meant to restore balance. That is why they tried to erase it. The Alpha King's eyes shifted slightly, acknowledging the guardian without looking away from the pup. Balance is a story told by those too weak to claim control, he replied calmly. The words were not loud, yet they crushed the space between them like falling stone. Warriors on both sides hesitated. Even the enforcers who had come to seize the air no longer moved forward. The battlefield was no longer about survival. It had become something far more dangerous, a confrontation between two truths that could not exist together. The golden light in the pup's chest pulsed again, stronger this time. The snow beneath Ara's knees melted in a perfect circle, untouched by heat yet transformed by presence alone. The pup lifted its head slowly, and when it opened its eyes fully, the entire valley seemed to recognize what it had become. Not a child of the wilderness, not an abandoned creature, but the last living vessel of a royal line that once commanded loyalty across every northern kingdom. The Alpha King took a single step forward. Every guardian instantly tightened their formation. The scarred guardian raised his weapon despite his exhaustion, but the Alpha King did not look at them. His focus remained on Ara. You should not exist here, he said quietly, his voice no longer carrying command but something closer to burden. You were never part of the prophecy. Ara's breath caught. The words were not spoken with accusation, but recognition, as if her existence itself was an anomaly in a pattern written long before her birth. The pup let out a soft sound, and the golden light expanded outward in response. For a brief moment, every warrior on the battlefield saw something different reflected in the light. Some saw crowns, some saw ruin, some saw a future where no Alpha ruled again. The Alpha King closed his eyes for the first time. When he opened them again, the decision had already formed. If the air awakens completely, he said, every kingdom will collapse into war. The shadow bloodline does not unite. It replaces. The scarred guardian stepped forward again, refusing to yield, or it corrects what your kind destroyed. A tension heavier than steel stretched across the valley. No one moved. No one dared to. Then the ground beneath them trembled. From beneath the snow, deep horns sounded once again. Not from any visible army, not from any known force. It came from the earth itself, as though something sealed beneath the world had finally responded to the air's awakening. Ara felt it before she saw it. A pull deep inside her chest. Not fear, not pain. Something older. A connection she could not explain. The pup pressed against her hands, and in that instant, its transformation stabilized. The golden light stopped expanding outward and instead condensed into a focused aura around its body. The Alpha King's expression shifted for the first time into something sharp and absolute. "No," he said quietly, but it was already too late. The valley beneath them split with a low, ancient fracture sound. Not destruction, revelation. From the opening ground, massive stone structures rose slowly into view. Forgotten ruins buried for centuries beneath ice and snow, symbols of the shadow bloodline carved across every surface. Towers that had never been recorded in any kingdom's history now stood awake beneath the storm. The scarred guardian fell to one knee. "They are answering," he whispered. Ara stared at the rising ruins, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The world she thought she understood was dissolving in real time. The Alpha King finally lowered his hand. For the first time, his voice carried something almost like warning. "This is the point of no return." The white wolf air lifted its head toward the ruins, and the entire valley answered with a sound that was not a roar, not a horn, but the awakening of an empire that had been waiting to remember itself. Ara stood at its center, still holding the creature that had changed everything. And for the first time since her exile, the world was no longer deciding her fate. It was waiting for her to decide its ending.
Deep beneath the frozen fortress, where no king ever dared to look, something impossible was still alive. The Alpha King's legendary beast, thought to be lost, broken, or dead, was not gone at all. It was hidden inside the forgotten laundry chambers, breathing in silence, healing in darkness, while the entire kingdom believed their ruler had fallen. Above it, the empire was collapsing from betrayal. Nobles smiled in daylight while secretly stealing the throne at night. The Alpha King stood alone, surrounded by liars, his power fading in the eyes of everyone who once feared him. They called him weak. They called him finished. But they never understood one thing. Even a broken king remembers how to hunt, and even a hidden beast never forgets its master. While the kingdom celebrated his downfall, something far below the palace was awakening again, stronger, darker, and more dangerous than before. Because when silence finally breaks, it doesn't return gently, it returns as domination. The Alpha King's fortress had stood for centuries as an unshakable symbol of power, fear, and absolute authority. Massive stone walls climbed toward the gray sky, surrounded by towering watchtowers where elite guards once stood, with unmatched confidence. Every banner that fluttered in the cold wind carried the mark of the royal bloodline, reminding every traveler that this land belonged to the strongest ruler alive. Yet beneath the grandeur of the fortress, something invisible had begun to rot. The walls remained strong, but trust had weakened. The soldiers still marched in perfect formation, but conviction had faded from their eyes. The people still bowed before the throne, yet many did so out of habit instead of loyalty. Rumors moved faster than horses, spreading from village to village, until even the smallest child had heard the same unsettling story. They whispered that the Alpha King's legendary beast had vanished without a trace. Some claimed it had died in a distant battle. Others insisted it had abandoned its master forever. No one knew the truth, but everyone agreed on one thing. A king who had lost his beast could no longer remain invincible. Inside the royal court, silence had become more dangerous than open conflict. The nobles no longer challenged the Alpha King directly because they understood that open rebellion would unite the kingdom against them. Instead, they mastered the art of quiet betrayal. Every council meeting became another opportunity to question his judgment without appearing disloyal. Every report exaggerated failures while hiding victories. Every messenger delivered carefully crafted information designed to isolate the king from those who still wished to serve him faithfully. Corrupt advisors slowly poisoned the foundation of his reign, replacing confidence with doubt. They smiled respectfully in his presence, yet the moment they stepped outside the throne room, they spread stories that painted him as a ruler whose strength had already faded. Their greatest weapon was not steel but uncertainty. Once uncertainty entered the minds of the people, fear naturally followed. The Alpha King sensed the shifting tide long before anyone dared to admit it aloud. He had ruled through countless winters and survived wars that had erased entire kingdoms from history. He recognized betrayal not because he saw it with his eyes, but because he felt its weight pressing against every decision he made. Once, when he entered the Great Hall, conversations immediately stopped out of respect. Now they stopped because those speaking feared they might be overheard. Once his commanders eagerly awaited his commands. Now they exchanged cautious glances before carrying out even the simplest order. Respect had begun transforming into hesitation, and hesitation was the first crack in every empire. The disappearance of the legendary beast had become the center of every whispered conversation. For generations, the enormous wolf-like guardian had stood beside every Alpha King, symbolizing the sacred bond between ruler and kingdom. It was more than a creature of immense strength. It represented destiny itself. Legends claimed no enemy could defeat a king whose beast remained at his side. When that bond suddenly disappeared, enemies both inside and outside the kingdom interpreted the event as a sign that fate itself had abandoned the throne. Rival Alpha rulers celebrated in secret, convinced that the greatest obstacle standing between them and conquest had finally been removed. Their spies flooded the kingdom, feeding every rumor and encouraging every doubt until fear spread like an endless winter storm. The Alpha King rarely appeared before the people anymore. Many believed he had become afraid, while others claimed grief had broken his spirit. The truth remained hidden beneath layers of silence. He spent long hours alone within the ancient library, studying forgotten records, maps, and journals left behind by his ancestors. Every page hinted that the disappearance of the beast had not been an accident. Tiny details refused to fit together naturally. Trusted scouts had vanished without explanation. Supply routes had been altered by unknown orders. Messages had disappeared before reaching their intended recipients. Every clue suggested the existence of a carefully planned conspiracy, yet none revealed the identity of those responsible. The more deeply he searched, the more isolated he became. Without undeniable proof, even loyal supporters hesitated to believe him. Throughout the palace, servants worked quietly, avoiding the growing tension surrounding the royal family. Among them was a young maid whose life had always been defined by simple responsibilities. She cleaned forgotten corridors, carried fresh linens through cold stone passageways, and spent most of her days inside the enormous laundry chambers hidden beneath the fortress. Unlike the nobles who constantly discussed politics, she paid little attention to court intrigue. Survival depended upon remaining invisible. Her greatest concern each day was completing her work without attracting unwanted attention. The lower halls, beneath the palace, rarely interested anyone else. Dust gathered in forgotten corners where generations of servants had quietly lived and disappeared without leaving their names behind. The underground laundry chamber had become one of the oldest neglected rooms inside the fortress. Warm air from ancient stone furnaces drifted through the chamber, creating a rare place of comfort beneath the otherwise freezing palace. Mountains of folded blankets, thick woolen cloth, and unused bedding filled every corner. Most servants disliked entering the room because strange sounds often echoed through the darkness. Some believed restless spirits haunted the lower halls. Others insisted enormous rats had nested beneath the old stone floors. Fear allowed the room to remain almost entirely abandoned. One cold morning, while carrying fresh blankets toward the deepest storage corner, the maid noticed something unusual. Several neatly folded sheets had been disturbed overnight. Heavy impressions remained pressed into the fabric as though something unimaginably large had rested there for hours. At first, she assumed workers had forgotten to organize the linens properly. Yet as she stepped closer, another detail caught her attention. Massive paw prints covered the dusty floor. They were far too large to belong to any ordinary animal. Each print disappeared beneath another pile of blankets stacked against the ancient wall. Curiosity overcame fear. Carefully moving several heavy blankets aside, she froze completely. Hidden within the warmth of countless folded linens lay an enormous black beast unlike anything she had ever imagined. thick dark fur covered a body marked with countless old scars. One shoulder carried a deep wound that had only partially healed. Slow, heavy breaths filled the chamber as the giant creature remained asleep, its powerful chest rising and falling with quiet exhaustion. Even while resting, it radiated overwhelming strength. Yet beneath that strength rested unmistakable pain. It looked less like a monster and more like a warrior who had survived impossible suffering. Instead of roaring or attacking, the beast remained motionless. Its breathing suggested complete exhaustion rather than aggression. The maid's heart pounded so violently she feared the creature might awaken simply by hearing it. Every instinct urged her to run toward the guards. Yet another feeling quietly held her in place. The wounds covering the beast were far too severe for a creature that had chosen violence. Someone had hunted it relentlessly. Someone had wanted this magnificent guardian to disappear forever. Without fully understanding why, she quietly placed one more clean blanket across the creature's injured side before stepping backward as silently as possible. She left the chamber carrying the same basket she had entered with, saying nothing to anyone she passed. Throughout the day, the image refused to leave her thoughts. She remembered the beast's scars, its exhausted breathing, and the strange feeling that it had chosen this forgotten place, not to hide from people, but to survive long enough to heal. Meanwhile, above the underground halls, the conspiracy continued tightening around the throne. Influential nobles met secretly after sunset, congratulating themselves on how easily public opinion had shifted. Every day the king's authority weakened a little more. Merchants questioned royal taxes. Military officers quietly delayed orders. Border governors began acting independently. Each small act of disobedience appeared insignificant alone, but together they slowly dismantled the foundation of the empire. The conspirators believed they had already secured victory because they judged strength only by appearances. They saw a silent king and assumed surrender. They saw a missing beast and assumed death. They never considered that silence could conceal preparation instead of defeat. The Alpha King stood alone that evening upon the highest balcony, overlooking the endless forests surrounding the fortress. Snow drifted gently across the mountains while darkness swallowed the distant horizon. Somewhere beyond those silent woods, his enemies believed destiny had finally chosen their side. Yet deep inside, he sensed something changing. The sacred bond he had thought completely lost flickered for only a single heartbeat before disappearing once again. It was faint enough to question whether it had truly happened at all, but it carried a feeling he had not experienced since the day his beast vanished. Hope, nearly forgotten beneath months of betrayal, stirred quietly within him. Far below the fortress, hidden beneath layers of stone, folded blankets, and forgotten hallways, the wounded beast slowly opened one golden eye. For the first time in many months, its breathing became steadier. Strength had not yet returned, but survival no longer seemed impossible. Unknown to every noble celebrating above, the greatest symbol of the Alpha King's destiny had never disappeared. It had merely been waiting in silence for the moment when both master and beast would be ready to rise together once again. Morning arrived beneath a sky covered with heavy gray clouds, but the atmosphere inside the Alpha King's fortress felt even darker than the weather beyond its walls. Every corridor carried the weight of uncertainty. Servants walked with lowered heads, guards spoke only when necessary, and members of the royal court carefully measured every word before allowing it to leave their mouths. The palace had become a place where silence held more danger than open conflict. Hidden beneath polished floors and magnificent halls, invisible lines had been drawn between loyalty and betrayal. Few people realized they were standing on one side or the other until it was already too late. Deep inside the forgotten laundry chamber, where warm air drifted from ancient stone furnaces, the enormous black beast remained hidden beneath layers of folded blankets. The maid returned before sunrise, carrying fresh water, clean cloth, and scraps of meat she had quietly collected from the royal kitchens. She knew that if anyone discovered what she was doing, suspicion alone could destroy her life. Yet each time she remembered the exhausted creature lying alone in the darkness, fear became easier to ignore than guilt. She approached slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. The beast opened its golden eyes the moment she entered, but instead of showing aggression, it simply watched her with quiet caution. Those eyes no longer reflected only pain. They carried intelligence, patience, and the silent dignity of something that had once stood beside kings. The wound across its shoulder still looked severe, though it had begun closing around the edges. The maid carefully placed food nearby before stepping back several paces. She never attempted to touch the beast or force it to trust her. Instead, she allowed kindness to speak where words were unnecessary. After several long moments, the beast lowered its massive head and slowly accepted the meal. Every movement remained cautious, as though it expected betrayal at any moment. Watching such a powerful creature eat with hesitation filled the maid with quiet sorrow. Whatever had happened to this guardian had not only injured its body, but had wounded its trust. Above the underground halls, another kind of hunger spread through the palace. It was the hunger for power. The nobles who secretly opposed the Alpha King grew increasingly confident with every passing day. Their plans had succeeded beyond expectation. Governors who once obeyed every royal decree now delayed their responses. Wealthy merchants quietly funded rival factions while pretending loyalty to the throne. Military commanders began questioning orders that would once have been carried out without hesitation. None of these actions openly challenged the king, yet together they weakened the kingdom from within. The conspirators smiled as they watched authority slowly dissolve, convinced that no force remained capable of stopping them. The Alpha King observed every change without revealing the storm building inside him. Many believed grief had robbed him of his strength, but in reality, silence had become his greatest weapon. Instead of confronting accusations with anger, he allowed his enemies to expose themselves through overconfidence. Every false report, every suspicious delay, and every whispered rumor became another piece of a larger puzzle. Alone inside the ancient library, surrounded by records written centuries before his birth, he continued searching for the hidden pattern connecting every betrayal. Among dusty scrolls forgotten by generations of rulers, he discovered an old account describing how an earlier Alpha King had nearly lost his kingdom through deception rather than battle. The story spoke of trusted advisors who had weakened the throne from within before attempting to seize complete control. What saved that kingdom had not been overwhelming strength, but patience. The ancient ruler had waited until every conspirator believed victory was certain. Only then had he acted, exposing every betrayal in a single decisive moment. Reading those forgotten pages awakened something inside the Alpha King that had nearly disappeared beneath months of disappointment. He realized that rushing toward revenge would only strengthen his enemies. True dominance required perfect timing. That same evening, while standing alone beneath the cold night sky, he felt the mysterious bond with his missing beast return once again. This time it lasted longer. The connection remained weak, little more than a distant heartbeat carried through endless darkness, but it was unmistakably real. His legendary companion had not died. Somewhere within the fortress itself, the bond continued struggling toward life. He closed his eyes, concentrating with absolute focus, yet the sensation disappeared before revealing its location. Even so, hope replaced despair for the first time since the beast had vanished. The maid noticed another change as the days passed. The beast no longer remained asleep for endless hours. It slowly walked through the hidden chamber during the quietest hours of the night, testing its injured body with careful movements. Though still weakened, every step appeared stronger than the last. She often discovered that it had rearranged the blankets into a sheltered resting place, almost as though it understood the importance of remaining hidden. Occasionally, she found deep claw marks pressed into the stone floor, evidence that the creature had begun rebuilding its strength. Despite its enormous size, it moved with remarkable silence, leaving almost no trace behind. One afternoon, while cleaning nearby storage rooms, the maid overheard several palace servants speaking in frightened whispers. They claimed strange growls echoed beneath the fortress after midnight. Others insisted something enormous had been moving through the underground corridors. The rumors spread quickly, reaching guards responsible for protecting the lower halls. Orders were soon given to inspect abandoned chambers over the coming days. Hearing this, the maid felt genuine fear for the first time. If soldiers entered the laundry chamber, they would certainly discover the beast before it had fully recovered. That night she returned earlier than usual, carrying additional blankets to better conceal the creature. As she quietly covered its resting place, the beast gently lifted its head. Instead of remaining distant, it slowly lowered its enormous muzzle toward her hand. For a single silent moment, trust replaced fear. The maid carefully rested her trembling fingers against the thick fur covering its forehead. The beast closed its eyes, accepting the gesture without resistance. No words were spoken, yet an invisible bond formed between them. She was no longer simply hiding an injured animal. She had unknowingly become the protector of the kingdom's greatest secret. Far above, the conspirators gathered once more inside a private chamber hidden beyond the royal council hall. Maps covered the table before them, marked with territories already slipping from the king's influence. They congratulated themselves on every successful manipulation. Soon, they believed, the remaining loyal commanders would either surrender or join their cause. One ambitious noble even suggested that the Alpha King should be quietly removed before he discovered the truth. None of them realized that their growing confidence had become their greatest weakness. Success blinded them to caution. They believed the king's silence proved defeat, never imagining that he was studying every move they made. Meanwhile, loyal soldiers who had never abandoned their oath continued watching events unfold with increasing concern. Though uncertain whom they could trust, many quietly refused invitations to join the conspirators. They remembered the Alpha King who had defended the kingdom through impossible battles and harsh winters. While doubt had reached their minds, respect had never completely left their hearts. They waited for a sign that their ruler still possessed the strength worthy of their loyalty. Late one evening, the Alpha King descended into the oldest sections of the fortress alone. Guided only by instinct, he wandered forgotten passageways untouched for generations. The mysterious connection with his beast had become stronger, pulling him toward the underground halls like an invisible thread. Yet every time he believed he had reached its source, the feeling shifted once more, remaining just beyond his reach. He eventually stopped beside an ancient stone wall separating the abandoned laundry chambers from an unused storage corridor. Standing there in complete silence, he placed one hand against the cold stone. On the opposite side of that wall, separated by only a few feet, the great beast suddenly raised its head. Neither master nor companion could see one another, yet both recognized the sacred bond returning after months of painful separation. The beast released the quietest growl imaginable, barely more than a low vibration. The Alpha King's eyes widened as the feeling rushed through him with unmistakable certainty. He knew now that his companion lived somewhere beneath the palace. He simply did not yet know where. The moment passed quickly. Footsteps echoed through the corridor as palace guards approached during their nightly patrol. The king calmly stepped away from the wall before anyone noticed his unusual behavior. Hidden behind piles of folded linens, the beast lowered itself once again into complete silence. Both understood that the time for reunion had not yet arrived. The kingdom remained surrounded by betrayal, and revealing the truth too soon would endanger everything they still hoped to reclaim. As another cold dawn approached, the conspirators celebrated what they believed would be their final weeks before complete victory. The maid continued protecting the wounded guardian with unwavering compassion. Loyal soldiers quietly searched for hope without realizing it already slept beneath their own feet. And the Alpha King, no longer broken by despair, began preparing for a future his enemies could not yet imagine. Far below the fortress, hidden inside the forgotten laundry chamber, the legendary beast slowly rose to its feet without trembling for the first time since its disappearance. Its wounds were healing, its strength was returning, and the ancient bond connecting ruler and guardian had awakened once again. Neither the conspirators nor the kingdom understood that the greatest danger they would ever face was no longer approaching from beyond the walls. It was rising from within them. Winter settled more heavily over the kingdom, covering forests, villages, and mountain roads beneath endless layers of snow. From a distance, The empire appeared peaceful, but beneath that frozen silence, invisible currents of conflict continued growing stronger. Every sunrise brought fresh rumors to the capital. Merchants whispered that border lords had begun withholding taxes. Traveling hunters claimed rival kingdoms were gathering soldiers near the northern mountains. Farmers spoke cautiously of officials demanding loyalty not to the throne but to powerful nobles within the palace. The Alpha King's enemies had not declared war openly. Instead, they slowly replaced faith with uncertainty until even ordinary citizens questioned whether the kingdom still possessed the strength to survive another winter. Inside the fortress, the Alpha King remained outwardly calm. Those who watched him believed defeat had stolen his spirit, yet behind his quiet expression, every passing day strengthened his resolve. He no longer wasted energy trying to convince doubtful nobles of his innocence or exposing traitors without proof. Instead, he devoted every moment to observing the movements of those surrounding him. Every delayed report, every missing supply shipment, every unusual meeting after sunset became another piece of a hidden design. The conspiracy that had once seemed impossible to understand slowly revealed its shape. It was larger than he had imagined, reaching through military leaders, wealthy merchants, influential governors, and members of the royal council. Yet the greater the conspiracy became, the more difficult it would be for its members to hide forever. The sacred connection between the Alpha King and his legendary beast continued growing stronger. Each evening, he felt its presence more clearly than the night before. Though they still remained separated by hidden walls and forgotten corridors, their spirits slowly recognized one another again. The king could sense the beast's growing strength, its steady heartbeat, and its determination to survive. That invisible bond became a source of quiet confidence. He no longer questioned whether his companion lived. The only remaining mystery was discovering where it had been hidden and who had worked so desperately to keep them apart. Far below the palace, inside the forgotten laundry chamber, the enormous black beast had recovered enough to move with confidence once more. The deep wound across its shoulder had nearly closed, leaving only a broad scar beneath its thick fur. Every night it stretched its powerful muscles inside the warm chamber, carefully rebuilding strength that months of hiding had nearly stolen away. Although its body had healed remarkably, it never attempted to leave the underground sanctuary. Its instincts remained disciplined. It understood that survival depended not on impatience, but on choosing the perfect moment to reveal itself. The maid noticed the remarkable transformation with quiet amazement. The frightened, exhausted guardian she had first discovered now stood taller, stronger, and far more alert. Yet despite its growing power, it remained astonishingly gentle in her presence. Whenever she entered the chamber carrying food or fresh water, the beast greeted her with calm golden eyes instead of suspicion. It accepted her care without fear, almost as though recognizing that her compassion had preserved its life when every other hand had sought its destruction. Their silent trust deepened with each passing day, forming a bond neither had expected. Meanwhile, the palace grew increasingly restless. Strange sounds continued echoing through the underground halls during the late hours of night. Guards reported hearing distant footsteps where no one should have been walking. Others spoke of low growls drifting through abandoned passageways before disappearing into silence. Fear spread among younger soldiers, many believing the old fortress had become haunted. The conspirators dismissed such stories as meaningless superstition, but they ordered more frequent patrols beneath the palace anyway. They feared hidden enemies far more than wandering spirits. The maid lived each day under growing pressure. Every patrol that entered the lower corridors increased the danger of discovery. She carefully altered her routine, visiting the laundry chamber at unpredictable hours while hiding every trace of the beast's existence. She swept away massive paw prints before guards could notice them, removed leftover bones after every meal, and rearranged blankets to conceal the guardian's resting place. Every small task carried enormous risk. One careless mistake could expose the greatest secret inside the kingdom. Above the underground halls, the Alpha King quietly began rebuilding relationships with those whose loyalty had never completely disappeared. Rather than summoning commanders publicly, he met trusted veterans individually during ordinary inspections or evening walks through the fortress. He never spoke of revenge. He never accused anyone without proof. Instead, he listened. The soldiers shared concerns about disappearing supplies, unusual military orders, and officers whose behavior had changed dramatically over recent months. Piece by piece, the king assembled a clearer understanding of how deeply betrayal had spread throughout his empire. His patience began producing unexpected results. Several honest officials who had remained silent out of fear quietly returned to his side. They provided forgotten records, hidden correspondence, and financial accounts revealing suspicious movements of wealth between influential nobles. None of the evidence alone proved treason, but together they painted a disturbing picture. The conspiracy had not merely weakened the throne. It had prepared to replace it entirely. The conspirators, however, remained unaware that their carefully hidden network had begun unraveling. Encouraged by months of apparent success, they grew increasingly careless. Secret meetings became more frequent. Trusted messengers carried sensitive documents without proper caution. Their confidence transformed discipline into arrogance. Each new mistake provided the Alpha King with another opportunity to understand the full extent of their ambition. One evening, while heavy snow buried the outer courtyards beneath fresh white silence, the Alpha King once again descended into the forgotten sections of the fortress. The invisible bond guiding him had become almost impossible to ignore. Every step seemed naturally directed toward the oldest underground halls. He followed narrow stone passages illuminated only by flickering torches until he reached the same ancient wall where he had previously sensed his companion's presence. This time the feeling overwhelmed him. Beyond the thick stone barrier, the legendary beast suddenly lifted its head. Its ears turned toward the wall, recognizing the familiar presence it had long believed lost. A deep vibration echoed quietly through its chest, not as a roar but as an instinctive acknowledgement of its master. The Alpha King rested his hand upon the cold stone once again. Though separated by solid rock, both master and guardian felt the sacred bond strengthen beyond anything either had experienced since the day of their separation. Neither attempted to break the silence. Both understood that patience remained their greatest weapon. Only a few steps away, hidden beyond stacked blankets and forgotten storage rooms, the maid paused in complete confusion. She sensed the beast's unusual excitement and wondered what invisible force had stirred such emotion within the normally calm guardian. Though she saw nothing beyond the chamber walls, she felt that something extraordinary had just occurred. The following morning brought unexpected tension to the palace. One of the conspirators demanded a complete inspection of every abandoned section beneath the fortress, claiming hidden smugglers might be using forgotten tunnels. His true intention, however, reached far beyond ordinary security. Rumors about strange movements underground had begun troubling even the traders themselves. They wanted certainty before moving forward with the final stage of their plan. The announcement spread quickly among palace servants. When the maid learned that armed guards would search every lower chamber within 2 days, fear tightened around her heart. She knew the beast had regained much of its strength, but facing dozens of soldiers before the Alpha King understood the truth would risk everything. For the first time since discovering the Guardian, she questioned whether continuing to hide it remained possible. That evening she entered the laundry chamber carrying food as usual, yet her movements lacked their normal calmness. The beast immediately sensed her unease. It watched her carefully, while she quietly prepared fresh water. Though unable to understand human words completely, it recognized fear. Slowly, the great guardian rose from its resting place and stepped closer. Its enormous form towered above her, yet its movements remained peaceful. The maid looked into its golden eyes and found unexpected courage there. Instead of seeing a dangerous predator, she saw unwavering determination. Far above them, the Alpha King reached another crucial realization. After studying every document collected during recent weeks, one detail finally became impossible to ignore. Every suspicious order, every missing supply shipment, every vanished scout, and every misleading report had passed through the hands of the same small group of influential nobles. The conspiracy no longer existed only in his suspicions. It had become a visible network. Though he still lacked the evidence necessary to expose them publicly, he now knew precisely where to focus his attention. The kingdom itself seemed to hold its breath as the days passed. Loyal soldiers quietly sharpened their weapons without understanding why they suddenly felt hope returning. Ordinary citizens noticed subtle changes in the king's posture and confidence whenever he appeared before them. Even his enemies sensed something had shifted, though they struggled to explain it. The defeated ruler they had mocked for months no longer carried himself like a broken man. He spoke little, revealed nothing, and reacted to provocation with unsettling calm. His silence no longer resembled surrender. It resembled preparation. Deep beneath the fortress, the legendary beast stood fully upon its powerful legs, its scars now symbols of survival rather than weakness. The maid finished arranging fresh blankets before quietly stepping toward the chamber entrance. As she reached the doorway, the guardian released a low, steady growl unlike any sound it had made before. It was not a warning. It was a promise. Above them, the conspirators finalized their plans, convinced that one final strike would remove the Alpha King forever. Below them, Master and Beast, still separated yet spiritually reunited, prepared for the moment destiny had been patiently waiting to reveal. Neither side understood that the coming confrontation would no longer decide only the fate of a throne. It would decide who truly deserved to rule an empire. The morning that changed the kingdom forever arrived beneath a sky filled with dark clouds. A freezing wind swept across the fortress walls, carrying an uneasy silence through every tower and courtyard. Even the oldest soldiers admitted they had never felt such strange tension hanging over the palace. It was as if the fortress itself knew that years of deception were about to reach their final moment. Inside the royal court, every noble took their place with carefully controlled expressions. Behind respectful faces hid fear, ambition, and greed. They believed the day had finally come to remove the Alpha King from power forever. None of them realized they had already stepped into the trap they had spent months building with their own hands. The Alpha King entered the great hall with calm, measured steps. His appearance surprised many who had not seen him closely for weeks. The exhaustion that once clouded his face had disappeared. His shoulders were straight, his eyes steady, and every movement carried quiet confidence. He spoke very little, allowing silence to spread through the enormous chamber. His enemies mistook that silence for uncertainty, just as they had done for months. They smiled to themselves, convinced that he still had no idea how deeply they had infiltrated the kingdom. The leader of the conspirators stepped forward with carefully prepared accusations. He claimed the kingdom had weakened because the Alpha King had lost the blessing of the ancient bloodline. He blamed failed harvests, restless borders, and growing unrest on the king's inability to protect the empire. One by one, several nobles nodded in agreement, pretending concern for the future while secretly hoping to seize power for themselves. They demanded that authority be transferred to a temporary council until a stronger ruler could be chosen. The words sounded respectful, but everyone inside the hall understood their true meaning. It was not advice. It was an attempt to strip the throne of its rightful owner. The Alpha King remained completely still. He neither defended himself nor argued against their claims. His silence unsettled even the loyal guards standing along the walls. They expected anger or disappointment, yet neither appeared. Instead, the king slowly looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of every noble one after another. Some confidently returned his gaze. Others lowered their eyes without realizing they had exposed their own fear. Months of careful observation had taught the king more about his enemies than they could ever imagine. Without raising his voice, he ordered several ancient records to be brought before the court. Large wooden chests were carried into the hall by trusted soldiers. Inside lay documents collected quietly over many months. Financial ledgers, secret correspondence, military orders, missing reports, and forgotten records filled the tables. The conspirators exchanged nervous glances for the first time. They recognized several seals they believed had been destroyed forever. One by one, Loyal officials presented evidence showing how supplies had been redirected away from royal armies, how border defenses had been intentionally weakened, and how false information had been delivered to the throne to isolate the king from his supporters. The atmosphere inside the Great Hall changed instantly. The confidence that had carried the conspirators into the meeting began fading beneath growing uncertainty. They attempted to dismiss the evidence as misunderstanding, claiming mistakes had occurred during difficult times. Yet every explanation created new contradictions. Every excuse uncovered another hidden connection between those responsible. The carefully woven network of betrayal began falling apart before the eyes of the entire court. Outside the throne room, the palace guards quietly received sealed orders prepared weeks earlier by the Alpha King. Loyal commanders moved without hesitation, surrounding offices belonging to the suspected conspirators. Hidden records were secured before anyone could destroy them. Messengers attempting to flee the fortress found every gate already under royal control. Months of patient planning unfolded with remarkable precision. The Alpha King had never intended to win through anger. He intended to win through preparation. Far beneath the fortress, the maid heard distant footsteps echoing through the underground corridors. The inspection she had feared had finally begun. Groups of armed soldiers searched forgotten storage rooms one after another, moving steadily closer to the hidden laundry chamber. She looked toward the enormous black beast resting quietly among the folded blankets. Unlike previous days, it did not appear anxious. Instead, it slowly stood to its full height, every powerful muscle ready. The deep scar across its shoulder no longer represented weakness. It had become proof of survival. The maid's heart raced as voices grew louder beyond the heavy wooden door. She knew discovery was only moments away. Yet before panic could overwhelm her, the beast calmly stepped toward the chamber entrance. It lowered its massive head briefly toward the young woman who had protected it through its darkest days. No fear remained inside its golden eyes. Only certainty. The wooden door opened. Several guards entered cautiously, expecting nothing more than abandoned storage. The moment they looked toward the far corner, every one of them froze. Rising from beneath layers of folded blankets stood the legendary guardian of the Alpha King. Though scarred by betrayal, it radiated overwhelming strength. Its dark fur shimmered beneath the torchlight, while its piercing golden eyes filled the chamber with silent authority. None of the guards reached for their weapons. Every soldier recognized the sacred beast from stories told throughout the kingdom. They understood immediately what its survival meant. Without aggression, the beast walked slowly past them. Each step echoed through the stone corridor with calm confidence. The guards instinctively lowered their heads as it passed. No command had been given. Respect came naturally. Word spread through the underground passages, faster than wildfire. The legendary guardian lived. Above, the royal court remained trapped in growing chaos as more evidence continued arriving. Loyal officers presented intercepted letters proving that several nobles had secretly negotiated with rival kingdoms while pretending to defend the empire. Wealth stolen from royal treasuries was recovered from hidden vaults. False military orders were traced directly to the conspirators themselves. Every attempt to deny responsibility collapsed beneath undeniable proof. Then, an unexpected sound echoed through the palace. A deep, powerful howl rolled across the fortress like distant thunder. Every conversation stopped instantly. The Alpha King slowly lifted his eyes toward the great entrance of the throne hall. The massive wooden doors opened without force. Silence swept through every corner of the chamber as the enormous black beast walked into the royal court. Snow clung lightly to its thick fur from the journey through the outer courtyards. The scars covering its body told the story of months spent surviving alone, yet nothing about its presence suggested weakness. It moved with the calm confidence of a guardian returning to its rightful place. The conspirators stared in disbelief. Faces that had moments earlier displayed arrogance now turned pale with fear. The foundation of their entire plan had rested upon one assumption. They believed the sacred beast had disappeared forever. Seeing it alive shattered every certainty they possessed. The beast crossed the length of the hall without acknowledging anyone except the Alpha King. When it finally reached the throne, It lowered its massive head beside its rightful master. In that single silent gesture, months of lies collapsed completely. The sacred bond had never been broken. It had only been hidden. The emotional balance inside the kingdom shifted at that exact moment. Loyal soldiers who had quietly doubted the future suddenly stood taller. Servants watching from distant corridors felt hope return. Even those who had hesitated to support the king realized they had judged him too quickly. Strength had never truly abandoned the throne. The Alpha King rested one hand gently upon the beast's scarred neck. Neither celebration nor anger appeared upon his face. He looked instead toward the conspirators with calm disappointment. Their greatest mistake had not been attacking him. It had been believing patience was weakness. One by one, the guilty nobles fell to their knees. Some begged for mercy. Others blamed one another in desperate attempts to escape responsibility. Alliances that had seemed unbreakable only hours earlier dissolved beneath fear. Greed had united them, but fear tore them apart far more quickly. The maid stood quietly near the entrance of the hall, unnoticed by nearly everyone. She watched as the guardian she had protected finally returned to its rightful place beside the Alpha King. She expected nothing in return. Simply seeing the beast safe was enough. Yet the Alpha King noticed her immediately. He recognized the quiet humility with which she stood apart from the celebration, seeking neither praise nor reward. Though no public announcement was made, he understood one truth beyond all doubt. Without the compassion of a simple servant, neither he nor the kingdom would have survived this betrayal. As the conspirators were taken into custody and loyal commanders secured every corner of the fortress, peace slowly returned to the palace for the first time in many months. Yet the Alpha King knew the struggle had not completely ended. Betrayal inside the kingdom had been exposed, but beyond the borders, rival rulers had already begun preparing for invasion, believing the empire remained vulnerable. Standing beside his legendary guardian upon the highest balcony overlooking the snow-covered kingdom, the Alpha King watched distant mountains disappear beneath gathering clouds. The throne had been reclaimed. The betrayers had fallen. The sacred bond had been restored. But far beyond the horizon, a greater storm was already moving toward the empire. And this time, the Alpha King would meet it not as a broken ruler struggling to survive. He would meet it as the true master of a kingdom finally awakened. The fortress no longer felt like a place of uncertainty. It had become a symbol of restored order, where silence no longer carried fear but discipline. The echoes of betrayal had finally faded, leaving behind a kingdom that was forced to confront its own weaknesses. The conspirators were gone, either imprisoned deep within the stone dungeons or stripped of all titles and influence. Their names were erased from the court records as if their ambition had never existed. Yet, even in victory, the Alpha King did not allow celebration to turn into blindness. He understood that true power was never proven in the moment of triumph, but in what came after it. The empire had been saved from internal collapse, but the world beyond its borders was still watching. The Alpha King stood once again in the Great Hall, but this time the atmosphere had changed completely. Nobles who once plotted in shadows now stood in silence with lowered heads, waiting for judgment and direction. Fear had been replaced with controlled respect. The difference was subtle but absolute. Where once they had tried to manipulate him, they now waited to be governed by him. The throne no longer felt like a burden he was struggling to hold. It felt like a responsibility he had finally mastered. Beside him, the legendary beast stood in calm stillness, its presence no longer hidden or feared but openly acknowledged as the empire's sacred guardian. The Alpha King began rebuilding the foundation of the kingdom with deliberate precision. He did not act with anger or vengeance, but with calculated structure. Every noble who had participated in betrayal was judged not by emotion, but by documented action. Those who had been misled but not fully corrupted were stripped of authority, yet spared punishment. Those who had actively planned the downfall of the throne were removed from power entirely and confined to the deepest dungeons of the fortress. There was no cruelty in his decisions, only finality. The empire learned that the new era would not be ruled by fear alone but by consequences that could not be avoided or manipulated. The maid who had unknowingly protected the legendary beast remained within the palace, though she did not seek recognition. She continued her duties quietly, as she always had, avoiding attention even as whispers of her role began spreading among the lower servants. Some called her the silent guardian of the beast. Others believed she had been chosen by fate itself. Yet she never confirmed or denied anything. When she crossed paths with the Alpha King, there was no ceremony, no reward, and no declaration of greatness. Only a quiet acknowledgement passed between them, one rooted not in status, but in understanding. She had preserved what others had abandoned, and the Empire would remember her influence even if her name never echoed in the grand halls. As days passed, the Alpha King focused on restoring order across every level of the Empire. Border provinces were reinforced with loyal commanders. Corrupt officials were replaced with tested strategists who had proven their loyalty during the crisis. Trade routes were secured, and military discipline was restructured to ensure that no single faction could again grow powerful enough to challenge the throne from within. The kingdom slowly transformed from a fractured system of competing ambitions into a unified structure governed by clarity and strength. Yet beneath this restoration, the king remained aware that internal unity was only one layer of survival. Beyond the borders, silence had begun to change into movement. Scouts returned with reports of shifting armies in distant kingdoms. Rival rulers who had once believed the Alpha Kingdom to be weakened now reconsidered their assumptions. They had expected collapse after the disappearance of the legendary beast and the rumors of internal betrayal. Instead, they witnessed a rapid consolidation of power under a ruler who no longer hesitated or doubted. This transformation did not discourage their ambitions. It sharpened them. For some kingdoms, a recovering empire was more dangerous than a collapsing one, because recovery meant strength was returning, not fading. The Alpha King understood this shift better than anyone. He no longer viewed threats as isolated events, but as interconnected movements of long-term strategy. Every report from the borders was analyzed with careful attention. Every unusual alliance forming between neighboring kingdoms was recorded and evaluated. He had learned that survival was not only about defeating enemies, but about understanding when enemies chose to unite. The legendary beast, now fully restored, remained by his side during these assessments, no longer hidden in shadows, but standing as a visible symbol of dominance. Its presence alone altered the behavior of those who entered the throne hall, reminding them that the era of weakness had ended permanently. Yet even as the empire stabilized, the Alpha King often found himself standing alone on the highest balcony of the fortress during the quiet hours of night. The wind carried the cold breath of distant mountains, and the kingdom stretched endlessly beneath him like a living map of responsibility. It was in these moments that he reflected not on victory, but on cost. Betrayal had been punished, order had been restored, but trust once broken never returned in its original form. Every noble who now bowed before him did so, with awareness of consequences rather than pure loyalty. That difference was subtle, but it shaped the future of his reign. The beast often stood beside him during these silent hours. No words were exchanged, yet understanding flowed between them in ways language could never capture. Their bond had survived destruction, separation, and deception. Now it represented something greater than companionship. It represented survival itself. Together, they had endured the collapse of trust and the rise of betrayal. Together, they had reclaimed what had nearly been lost.
The kingdom did not fall in war. It fell in silence. 12 giant royal wolves were drowning beneath a frozen river when the entire army disappeared without a trace. Betrayal did not come from enemies. It came from the throne itself. Far away, in the freezing wilderness, a nameless woman pulled one wolf after another from the ice, fighting death with bare hands. Unaware she was saving something the kingdom had already declared dead. The 12th wolf did not move like the others. It did not behave like a beast. It breathed like something remembering, a forgotten crown. At that exact moment, the capital crowned a new ruler, believing the Alpha King was gone forever. But deep in the snow, the last wolf opened its eyes. and the world changed, because what she saved from the river was not just a creature. It was a king erased from history, and the moment his presence awakened, the throne he lost began to crack on its own. But here is the real question. If the Alpha King is alive, who has been ruling in his place? And how long before he takes it all back? The frozen river screamed before the sky did. Ice cracked like broken bones stretching across a dying world, splitting the northern valley into jagged pieces of white chaos. Wind howled through the shattered landscape as if the kingdom itself was mourning something it had not yet understood. Beneath the collapsing surface of the water, massive shadows moved violently, trapped and suffocating under the crushing weight of freezing death. 12 giant wolves of the Royal Alpha Legion were drowning slowly, their bodies dragging under the ice, claws scraping helplessly against invisible walls of solid water. Each movement sent shockwaves through the river, but none were strong enough to break the prison that had swallowed them. Above the chaos, armored warriors stood frozen in hesitation. Not from fear of the wolves, but from the silence of command that had betrayed them. The royal escort had been attacked from within. No enemy banner had crossed the border. No rival army had been seen approaching. The destruction had come from trusted hands. That realization hung heavier than the freezing air itself. Somewhere behind the lines, the Alpha King was supposed to be protected. Instead, his presence had vanished from the battlefield like a ghost swallowed by betrayal. Deep inside the collapsing river system, one of the wolves let out a low, broken sound that barely reached the surface. It was not just pain. It was recognition of death approaching without mercy. The ice above it pulsed with cracks widening like veins of a dying beast. The water beneath churned violently, pulling everything downward into darkness. The wolves were not ordinary creatures. They were extensions of the Alpha King's will, bound to his presence, trained to move like living shadows of his authority. And now they were being erased one by one. Far away from the political collapse and hidden treachery, the edge of the frozen forest remained untouched by war. There, a young woman moved through the snow with quiet urgency. Her hands were red from cold, her breath visible in slow, trembling waves, but her steps never hesitated. She was known only to the small settlements scattered along the northern wilderness, a figure of compassion where survival usually erased mercy. She had no army, no protection, no title that the world would respect. Yet she moved toward the sound of destruction, as if something inside her refused to accept silence as an answer. When she reached the river, she stopped. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood instinctively that what she was seeing was not natural disaster. It was engineered collapse. The ice was breaking in controlled patterns. The water currents were forced, directed. Something had been trapped below on purpose. Her eyes followed the shifting cracks until she saw movement beneath the surface. Massive shapes twisting, struggling, fading. Without waiting for understanding to form fully in her mind, she stepped onto the ice. It groaned under her weight, warning her with deep cracking sounds that echoed across the valley. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn back. But something deeper pulled her forward, something that felt like recognition without memory. The first wolf broke through the ice near her feet. Half conscious, its body dragged upward by sheer force of desperation. Its fur was soaked, its breathing unstable, its eyes flickering between life and collapse. She did not hesitate. She grabbed its massive shoulder and pulled with all her strength. The ice resisted like a living enemy. Her hands slipped, her knees sank into freezing water, but she refused to let go. With one final pull, the wolf collapsed onto the surface, gasping violently as air returned to its lungs. One by one, she began to pull them out. Each rescue drained something from her body. Each wolf was heavier than the last, not just in weight, but in presence. They were not ordinary beasts. There was an unnatural intensity in their aura, as if each one carried fragments of a greater will. The ice beneath her fractured further with every movement. Time itself felt unstable in that place, stretched between survival and collapse. Far above, hidden watchers observed from the edge of the tree line. They did not intervene. They did not reveal themselves. Their armor was marked with symbols of the new regime that had already begun to rise in the capital. They were not here to save anyone. They were here to ensure nothing survived that could challenge the new order. Their attention sharpened as they saw the woman pulling out the wolves, not because she was helping them, but because she was interfering with something they had already decided should end. As the ninth wolf was dragged from the ice, the wind shifted. A deep pressure rolled across the valley, subtle but undeniable. The remaining wolves beneath the water began to react differently, not with panic, but with awareness, as if something inside them had changed. The woman felt it too, a weight in the air that pressed against her chest, making every breath slightly harder. The final wolf beneath the ice was still unconscious, but something about its presence was different from the others. The water around it was darker, denser, almost unwilling to release it. She knelt at the edge of the broken ice and looked down. For the first time, hesitation entered her movement. The shape beneath the surface was larger than the rest. Its presence was not just physical but symbolic, like the river itself was resisting its removal. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the freezing water again. The cold bit into her skin with unnatural force, as if the water was trying to reject her entirely. She wrapped her arms around the massive form and pulled. The moment she touched it, something strange happened. A pulse, not from the river, from the wolf itself. A deep, faint reaction that echoed through her body like a memory she had never lived. Her breath caught, but she forced herself forward. The ice cracked violently around them, the pressure increasing as if the world itself was collapsing inward to stop her. With one final, desperate motion, she dragged the wolf onto the surface. It lay still, too still. The others had moved. This one did not. She leaned closer, checking for breath, unaware that she was now kneeling beside something the entire kingdom believed was already gone. The Alpha King had been declared dead in the capital days ago. A betrayal had erased his existence from official record. His throne had already been claimed by those who stood closest to him. But here, beneath frozen wind and shattered ice, the truth had not died. It was breathing quietly beneath a wolf's body. And as the woman placed her hands on his chest to feel for life, the world around her seemed to pause for the first time since the river began to break. Far away in the capital, the new Alpha throne was being raised, and in that exact moment, the last surviving wolf opened its eyes, not as an animal, but as something far more dangerous, remembering it had once been a king. The ice beneath the woman's knees cracked one final time, deeper than before, as if answering a name no one had spoken aloud yet. The night did not feel like night anymore. It felt like something heavier had settled over the world, as if the sky itself had lowered its head in silence. Deep inside the frozen forest, the wind no longer moved freely. It pressed against the trees like an invisible force trying to listen to something buried beneath the earth. Somewhere far from the broken river, life had begun again in silence. But it was not the same life that had existed before the ice collapsed. The young woman moved through the snow with exhausted steps, carrying the weight of survival she did not fully understand. Behind her, the rescued wolves followed without sound. Not as animals driven by instinct, but as beings drawn to something deeper in her presence. Their eyes never left the unconscious final wolf she had dragged from the frozen river. It lay on a wooden sled made from broken forest branches, its massive body still unmoving, still resisting the idea of returning to life. She had not spoken since leaving the river, not because there was nothing to say, but because every breath felt heavier than the last. Something about the final wolf stayed inside her mind like a shadow she could not shake. The moment she touched it, the world had reacted. A pulse she could not explain had passed through her body, leaving behind a strange emptiness, as if part of her awareness had been momentarily pulled into something else. The forest village appeared slowly through the falling snow. Small wooden shelters, half buried in white silence, barely held against the northern cold. Smoke rose from scattered chimneys like fading signals of survival. People inside those homes lived unaware of the storm that had just passed beyond the river. To them, the world remained simple. Life, hunger, survival. Nothing beyond that. But the woman knew something had changed. She brought the sled to the edge of the settlement and stopped. The wolves did not move forward immediately. They watched the village with caution, as if they were entering a place that did not belong to them anymore. The final wolf remained still, its chest barely rising, its presence heavy in a way that did not match its condition. Even unconscious, it felt like something that should not be placed on the ground of ordinary lives. An old healer from the village approached slowly, noticing the massive shapes behind her. His expression shifted from confusion to concern as he saw the injured wolves. "This is dangerous," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of fear more than authority. "These are not normal beasts. You should not have brought them here." The woman did not respond immediately. Her hands were still trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper she could not name. She looked at the final wolf again, her eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for something beneath its fur. "I did not choose this," she finally said. "It was already happening when I found them." The healer stepped closer, studying the unconscious creature. The others reacted instantly, shifting their positions between him and the wolf, as if protecting it without instruction. That reaction alone made the old man step back. "These are not wild animals," he whispered. "They are bound. I can feel it." The woman did not understand what he meant, but she felt the truth in his words anyway. There was something unnatural in the silence of the final wolf. Not emptiness, but controlled absence, as if its presence had been deliberately hidden beneath layers of existence. Inside the village, word spread quickly. Strangers bringing massive wolves into a settlement was not something that could remain unnoticed. People gathered at a distance, watching from behind wooden walls and half-closed doors. Fear and curiosity moved together through the crowd, but no one dared approach too closely. The woman placed the sled near a fire pit outside the healer's shelter. Warm light flickered across the snow, revealing the deep injuries of the wolves more clearly. The others had begun to recover slowly, their breathing steadier, their bodies reacting to warmth. But the final wolf remained unchanged. It did not respond to heat. It did not respond to movement. It did not respond to life. Only silence surrounded it, deeper than anything she had ever seen. As night deepened, the village settled into uneasy stillness. The wolves lay close together, forming a protective circle around the unconscious one. The woman sat nearby, watching without realizing she had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment the river cracked open. Not the destruction, but the feeling beneath it, a presence that had reacted to her touch. Hours passed before the first sign appeared, a faint shift in the final wolf's breathing, so subtle that she almost missed it. Then another. The air around it grew heavier, not physically but emotionally, the kind of pressure that made thoughts slow down without explanation. The wolves around it lifted their heads at the same time, sensing the change before anyone else could. The woman leaned forward slightly. Something was happening. The healer, who had been observing from a distance, froze as he noticed the change as well. His expression darkened with something close to recognition, though he could not explain why. "This should not be possible," he muttered. "Not after what it endured." The final wolf's chest rose again, this time more firmly, a slow return to breath that did not feel natural but deliberate, as if something inside it had chosen to begin again. The woman moved closer without thinking. Her hand hovered above its fur, uncertain whether to touch it again. The moment she did, the reaction returned. That same pulse from the river, weaker now but undeniable. It traveled through her arm, up her spine, and settled somewhere deep in her awareness. Her breath stopped. This time she saw something, not a vision, not a memory, but a feeling of a vast space collapsing inward. A throne made of silence, a voice that had never been spoken but had always commanded. And beneath it all, a presence that refused to disappear even after being erased. She pulled her hand back quickly, shaken. The wolves around her stood up, not aggressively, but in recognition. The healer stepped forward now, his fear replaced by something sharper. "Whatever this is, he said quietly. "It is not what it appears to be." At that exact moment, the final wolf moved, not fully awake, but enough. Its claws pressed slightly into the ground beneath it. Snow around its body trembled as if responding to pressure that came from within rather than outside. Its head tilted faintly, struggling against unconsciousness but not in weakness, in resistance. And then, for the first time since the river collapse, its eyes opened halfway, not looking at the woman, not looking at the village, but staring into something far beyond it. The entire group froze, because in that single half-opened gaze, there was no animal left, only something buried beneath identity, struggling to return. Far away in the capital, unseen by anyone in the village, banners rose above the palace walls announcing a new alpha authority. And at the exact same moment, the final wolf finally inhaled fully for the first time, not as a survivor, but as something, remembering it had once ruled death itself and the woman. Realized too late that she had not saved a wolf from the river. She had pulled something back into the world that the entire kingdom had already decided should never return. The snow outside the village began to fall harder, as if the sky itself had recognized the beginning of something it could no longer prevent. The silence inside the forest broke like a living thing snapping under pressure. Snow stopped falling for a moment, as if even the sky had paused to witness what was emerging from beneath forgotten death. Inside the small village, every breath felt heavier, every sound sharper. The final wolf no longer lay like a broken creature. Its body had changed in subtle but terrifying ways, not in shape but in presence. The air around it felt compressed, as though reality itself was adjusting to something returning that had once been removed from it. The young woman stood motionless beside the fire pit, her eyes fixed on the creature that had already begun to defy explanation. The wolves around it no longer behaved like rescued animals. They stood in alignment, not by instinct but by recognition. Something inside them had awakened at the same rhythm, a shared awareness that had nothing to do with survival anymore. It was obedience returning to its source. The healer had stepped back completely now. His face had lost all color. Years of living in isolation, studying wounds and survival, had never prepared him for something that felt like authority without movement. "This is not recovery," he whispered. "This is return." The woman did not respond. Her mind was still trapped in the memory of the river, in that strange pulse that had passed through her body the moment she touched the final wolf. She had tried to ignore it, tried to explain it as shock or exhaustion, but it was no longer something she could dismiss. Something inside her had changed the moment she pulled it from the water. The final wolf shifted again. This time, the movement was not uncertain. It was controlled, its claws pressed into the snow and pushed slightly forward. The motion was small, but it carried weight that made the surrounding air feel unstable. The wolves around it lowered their heads slowly, not in fear, but in alignment. The village, which had been whispering moments earlier, fell into complete silence. The healer moved closer again, despite his fear. "There are old stories," he said carefully. "Stories buried under northern winters. They speak of wolves that are not wolves. They speak of bodies used as vessels when kings are erased from existence. But those are stories meant to scare children." His voice faltered. As the final wolf lifted its head slightly higher, the sitio woman stepped forward without thinking. Something about it was pulling her closer again. The same force she had felt at the river. Not physical attraction, but something deeper. A recognition she could not place. Her instincts warned her to stop, but her body ignored them. The final wolf opened its eyes fully, and everything changed. The moment its gaze settled into the world, the atmosphere inside the village collapsed inward. Not violently, but completely. The wolves around it lowered themselves further, as if responding to something absolute. The healer stumbled backward, unable to maintain balance under the pressure of presence alone. The woman froze, because those eyes were not empty. They were aware, not of the village, not of her, but of something far beyond all of it. As if consciousness had returned from a place that normal thought could not follow. A low breath escaped the creature's throat, deeper than anything an animal should have been capable of producing. The sound carried through the snow and settled into every corner of the settlement, like a command that did not need words. The woman felt it again, that pulse, but stronger now. It did not just pass through her body this time. It aligned with it. Her breathing slowed without intention. Her thoughts sharpened without effort. Something inside her mind briefly touched a structure that did not belong to her, and then withdrew before she could understand it. The final wolf rose halfway from the ground. Snow fell from its fur like fragments of a broken illusion. The movement was slow, deliberate, and deeply unnatural in its control. It did not look like recovery. It looked like reconstruction. The healer whispered something under his breath, but no one heard him clearly. His voice was lost under the weight of realization forming too slowly in his mind. The wolves around the final one suddenly shifted again. Their alignment changed from submission to formation. Not random movement, but organized positioning, as if responding to invisible command lines that had suddenly become active again after being dormant for too long. The woman stepped back instinctively. The fire behind her flickered violently, even though no wind had moved through the village. The final wolf turned its head slightly toward her and paused. For the first time, its gaze focused on something specific. Her. The connection was not emotional. It was not familiar in a human sense. It was recognition at a level deeper than identity. Something inside it acknowledged her presence not as rescuer or stranger, but as the point through which return had become possible. The woman's breath became uneven. Her chest tightened, not from fear alone, but from pressure she could not explain. Her knees weakened slightly, as if the ground beneath her was no longer fully stable. The healer finally spoke, voice trembling. "Step away." But she could not move. The final wolf stood fully now. Its body was no longer collapsing under injury or exhaustion. It stood as something reassembled, something that had reclaimed structure after being dissolved. The surrounding wolves lowered themselves completely, their heads touching the snow, forming a silent circle of submission. The village itself felt smaller now, not physically, but in presence, as if something had expanded within it that made everything else feel secondary. The final wolf took one slow step forward, the snow beneath. Its paw did not break, it held, as if the ground itself had decided not to resist it anymore. The woman's mind flashed briefly with fragments. She did not understand. A throne without shape, a river of frozen silence, a voice that had once commanded armies without needing sound. She could not hold the images long enough to interpret them, but they left behind emotional weight that made her chest ache. The final wolf stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel its breath. But instead of hostility, there was stillness. Deep, controlled stillness. Then something impossible happened. The wolf's eyes shifted, slightly, not away from her, but through her, as if looking beyond the physical world she occupied. The healer dropped to one knee without realizing it. The villagers watching from afar began to retreat instinctively, unable to explain the fear rising in them. And then the final wolf exhaled slowly. The sound was not loud, but it carried meaning. The woman's vision blurred for a fraction of a second. When it cleared, something had changed again, not in the world, but in perception. She suddenly understood that what stood before her was not simply recovering, it was remembering, and memory in something like this was not passive. It was return of authority. The final wolf tilted its head slightly, as if testing the boundary between past and present. The wolves around it remained frozen in submission. Even the wind outside the village slowed, as if waiting for direction. The healer's voice broke the silence again, weaker now. Whatever this is, it is not finished waking up. The woman felt her hands tremble, because she realized something she had not been willing to consider until now. If this was not finished waking up, then what she had pulled from the river was not a survivor. It was something paused, something waiting, something that had not yet decided what it would become again. The final wolf's gaze sharpened slightly, and in that moment, far beyond the forest, in the distant capital where a false throne had already been raised, the newly crowned rulers suddenly felt a shift they could not explain, as if something they believed was gone had just opened its eyes again, and the woman standing in the snow realized the truth too late. She had not rescued a dying creature. She had restarted something the entire kingdom had already tried to erase. The final wolf took another step forward, and the air itself seemed to wait for what it would become next. The capital burned in. Silence before it burned in fire. Not real fire at first, but the fire of authority collapsing into chaos. The banners of the new regime had already been raised across the highest towers, yet something beneath them was beginning to rot. Guards moved through the palace corridors with forced confidence, but their footsteps no longer carried certainty. Every sound inside the royal structure felt slightly delayed, as if the building itself was reacting too slowly to something it could not yet see. At the center of the throne hall, the new Alpha ruler sat beneath a crown that did not feel like his own. It had been placed on his head by advisors who spoke too quickly and smiled too carefully. The throne had once belonged to a king who ruled without hesitation. Now it belonged to men who ruled through fear of absence rather than strength of presence. But something was wrong. It began as a feeling, a pressure in the air that did not belong to the room. The advisors noticed it first, though none of them spoke about it. Their eyes drifted toward the tall windows of the hall, where the frozen horizon of the north stretched endlessly. The same horizon where the old king had supposedly died. The same horizon they had stopped thinking about too quickly. Then, the guards outside the palace gates began to report. Disturbances, not invasions, not armies. Something worse. Silence, moving against them. In the frozen forest far from the capital, the transformation had already begun. The final wolf stood motionless in the snow, but the world around it no longer treated it like a creature. The air itself felt structured around its presence. The woman stood several steps away now, her body tense, her instincts torn between stepping forward and running. The healer had retreated completely, unable to maintain composure under what he could no longer rationalize. The wolves that had been rescued no longer behaved like wounded animals. They had formed a silent perimeter, not as protection, but as recognition, as if something ancient had been restored in front of them, and they had remembered their place within it. The final wolf took another step forward. The snow did not resist. The woman's breath tightened as she felt the pressure in the air increase again. It was not physical weight. It was something closer to authority returning layer by layer into the world. Every instinct she had told her to step back, but something deeper prevented her from moving. Wolf stopped directly in front of her. Again, this time closer, and then it lowered its head, slightly not in submission, not in weakness, but in recognition of alignment. The woman's mind fractured briefly under the sensation. She saw flashes again. Not visions she could control, but impressions that did not belong to human understanding. A battlefield covered in silence. A river breaking under impossible weight. A throne room filled with people kneeling without being ordered. Her knees weakened slightly. The healer finally spoke, his voice trembling. It is not becoming a wolf anymore. The woman did not respond, because she already knew. Something inside it was reorganizing itself beyond physical form. The presence she felt was no longer fragmented. It was stabilizing. The final wolf lifted its head. Again, and the air changed. Completely, the wolves behind it all lowered. Themselves at once. Not in reaction, in synchronization. The village beyond the clearing began to feel it too. Doors slowly opened. People stepped outside without understanding why. Something in their bodies responded before their minds could interpret it. A presence that demanded awareness. The final wolf took one slow breath, and when it exhaled, something invisible spread outward through the forest. Woman felt it pass through her again, but this time it did not leave confusion. It left certainty. Her eyes widened slightly as realization formed fully. This was not a recovery. This was activation, far away in the capital. The reaction began instantly. The throne room lights flickered once, not from wind, from imbalance. The advisors turned toward each other, sensing something shift in the foundation of their control. The crowned ruler stood slightly, his expression tightening as a strange pressure entered the hall. Outside the palace, guards froze mid-movement, because from the northern horizon, something was coming that could not be measured in distance or time. Back in the forest, the final wolf's body began to change again, not physically in a visible way at first, but in the way it occupied space. The air around it felt denser. The silence around it felt controlled rather than empty. Even the wind seemed to adjust its path subtly around its presence. The woman stepped back one more time, finally breaking the paralysis. But she was too late to escape what was already unfolding. The final wolf's eyes closed, and for a brief moment, absolute stillness covered everything. The forest, the village, the capital far away, even the wind itself seemed to pause. Then it opened its eyes. Again. And the world responded, not loudly, not violently, but completely. The pressure that had been building since the river collapsed finally reached its peak. The final wolf no longer looked like a recovering creature. It looked like something returning to its rightful state. The healer fell to his knees without understanding why. The woman's breath became shallow as she felt the truth settle fully into her awareness. This was not just a surviving beast. This was a command structure reassembling itself, and she had been standing too close to it the entire time. The final wolf turned its head slightly, and for the first time, it looked past her completely, as if something else had arrived, something that did not belong to the forest. The woman followed its gaze instinctively, and that was when she felt it too. Not sound, not sight, but presence. Something approaching from far beyond the village, something that made the air itself feel like it was preparing for judgment. The wolves around her stood again in perfect alignment. The healer whispered, barely audible, "It is not just waking. It is being followed." The woman's heart tightened, because she understood what that meant without needing explanation. Whatever she had pulled from the river was not isolated. It was connected to something larger. Something that had already started moving before she even realized it existed. The final wolf took one step forward again, and this time, the ground beneath it responded. Snow shifted outward in a perfect circle, as if the world itself had acknowledged its return. And then, for the first time since the river, a sound broke through the silence, not from the wolf, not from the forest, but from the distant direction of the capital. A signal horn, followed by another, and another. The woman turned sharply toward the sound. The healer's face went pale, because those horns were not warnings. They were recognition signals used only when something classified as impossible had been detected approaching the kingdom. The final wolf stood still, and in that stillness, something inside it finally aligned completely. The woman felt it before she understood it. A shift, not in emotion, not in behavior, but in identity. And then the final wolf took one last step forward. Its presence expanded silently across the forest, across the snow, across distance itself. And the woman realized the truth with a cold clarity that made her chest tighten. She had not saved the last wolf. She had brought back something the entire kingdom had already declared dead. And somewhere far away, the throne that had been stolen began to feel something it had never been designed to withstand. The gates of the capital trembled before they even opened, not from siege engines, not from armies, but from something far more unsettling. The guards stationed at the outer walls felt it first, a pressure in the air that did not belong to weather or war. The snow beyond the horizon had begun to fall, differently, as if even nature was adjusting its rhythm to something approaching from beyond comprehension. Inside the palace, The false alpha ruler stood again, his crown suddenly heavier than it had been moments before. The throne room no longer felt stable. Conversations among advisors slowed, then stopped entirely. Every instinct inside them began to warn of something they could not yet name. Then the first report arrived. The northern forests had gone silent, completely. No movement, no wildlife, no wind patterns behaving naturally, as if something had passed through and taken control of even silence itself. The false ruler ordered denial, before fear could take shape, but his voice did not carry authority anymore. It carried uncertainty. And uncertainty was something the capital had not experienced since the original Alpha King had vanished. Far beyond the walls, in the frozen wilderness, the woman stood frozen in place. The final wolf no longer looked like a creature bound to the earth. It stood as if the world itself had adjusted its rules around its existence. The wolves that once followed instinct now stood in formation, not as animals, but as extensions of something larger returning to awareness. The healer had already retreated into silence, unable to reconcile what he was witnessing. His entire understanding of life, healing, and nature had collapsed under the weight of something that should not exist. The woman's breathing was shallow. Every instinct in her body screamed that she was standing too close to something she could not survive if it fully awakened. Yet she did not move. Something inside her refused to retreat, as if her own existence had become tied to what was unfolding before her. The final wolf took one step forward, and the snow beneath it responded like it had been waiting. Not breaking. Not resisting, just accepting. The air grew heavier again, not physically, but in a way that made thought itself feel slower. The woman's vision sharpened painfully, every detail becoming more defined as if reality itself was preparing to record what was about to happen. The wolf stopped and lifted its head toward the distant horizon, the capital. The woman followed its gaze, and felt it too, not sight, not sound. Presence, a force moving across the land like a memory returning to something that had forgotten it once belonged to it. The healer whispered weakly, "It is not here. It is coming." The woman's heart tightened, because she finally understood the scale of what she had triggered. This was no longer about survival or recovery. It was about convergence. Something had begun in the river, passed through the forest, and was now reaching outward into the world itself. The final wolf closed its eyes for a brief moment, and in that moment, everything changed. The capital's gates slammed shut on their own, not by command, by reaction. Inside the throne room, the false ruler stepped back as the massive doors of the palace began to tremble. The advisors finally lost all composure, moving toward exits that no longer felt safe. The guards outside the throne room tightened their grip on weapons they suddenly did not believe would be enough. Then it arrived. Not physically at first, but in awareness, a pressure so complete it felt like identity itself was being evaluated by something older than authority. The false alpha ruler's crown slipped slightly, just enough to make him realize he was no longer the center of anything. And then the doors opened. Slowly. Not broken. Not forced. Just opened. As if the structure itself had decided resistance was no longer relevant. A wind passed through the throne hall. But it was not wind. It carried memory. And with it, recognition. Every guard inside the hall froze as their bodies responded before their minds could process what they were seeing. At the entrance stood a figure, not fully defined at first, not fully human in presence, but undeniable in authority. The return had begun. Back in the forest, the final wolf opened its eyes again, but this time there was no hesitation, no instability, only clarity. The woman felt her breath stop completely as she realized the alignment had finished. What stood before her was no longer a recovering creature. It was something reassembled, something restored. The wolves around it lowered their heads once more, but now the gesture carried finality instead of uncertainty. The healer collapsed fully to the ground, unable to remain standing under the pressure of what his mind could no longer process. The woman's voice came out barely above a whisper. "What are you?" The final wolf did not respond in words. It did not need to, because the world itself began to respond for it. Far away, in the capital, the false ruler fell from his throne. Not from force. From recognition collapse, because the presence now filling the throne room was no longer something he could pretend did not exist. The advisors backed away as the figure stepped forward, and with each step, the illusion of stolen authority fractured further. Outside the palace, the skies shifted. Snow began to fall in reverse motion for a brief moment, as if time itself had misaligned in confusion. Inside the throne room, the figure stopped at the base of the throne and lifted its gaze. The false ruler could not speak, could not command, could only understand that everything he had built was standing on borrowed absence, and absence had just ended. Back in the forest, the final wolf's body began to shift again, but this time, it was not transformation. It was revelation. The woman stumbled back as the air itself tightened, because she finally saw it, not through vision, not through memory, but through certainty that struck deeper than understanding. The presence she had been interacting with was not a beast, not a creature, not even a survivor. It was something that had been stripped of identity and forced into silence. And silence had finally ended. The final wolf took one step forward, and in that step, everything aligned. The capital, the forest, the river, the memory of betrayal, the collapse of a kingdom. All of it converged into a single returning truth. The woman fell to her knees without realizing why, because her body understood before her mind accepted it. The final wolf was no longer just awakening, it was reclaiming. And somewhere far away, in the collapsing throne room, the false ruler finally heard it. Not sound, not voice, but identity returning to the world. The Alpha King had come back, and the kingdom that thought it had replaced him was about to learn what it meant to exist under the rule of something that had never truly left. The final wolf turned its gaze toward the woman one last time, and for the first time, there was no confusion in its eyes, only certainty. As if it now remembered everything. And then, in the silence that followed, the air itself seemed to bow. But somewhere deep inside the returning presence, something even more dangerous began to surface. Not revenge, not anger, but judgment. And the woman realized, too late, that what she had saved from the river was not returning to be grateful. It was returning to decide what the world was still allowed to be. The snow fell harder over the forest. The world did not celebrate when the Alpha King returned. It trembled. The first sound was not war horns or royal proclamation. It was silence collapsing under its own weight. Inside the capital, the throne room no longer felt like a place of power. It felt like something hollow had been filled with something it could not contain. The false ruler lay beneath shattered steps of authority, his crown broken beside him, his ambition reduced to something small and unrecognizable. No, one spoke, not because they were ordered to remain silent, but because speech itself felt unnecessary in the presence that now filled the hall. The Alpha King stood at the base of the throne, no longer in the form of a beast, no longer trapped between memory and instinct. The transformation was complete, but it was not loud. It did not announce itself. It simply existed, as if reality had corrected a mistake it had been carrying for too long. Every guard in the hall felt it at the same time. Their weapons lowered without command. Their bodies reacted before their minds could resist. The weight of presence alone was enough to dissolve resistance that had been built over years of fear and loyalty to false. The Alpha King did not rush forward. He did not need to. The throne itself felt smaller as he approached it. Not physically, but in meaning. What once represented absolute authority now looked like something temporary, something borrowed, something that had been sitting in the dark, pretending to matter. He placed one hand on the arm of the throne, and for a brief moment, the entire structure of the capital reacted, not breaking, not collapsing, but acknowledging. The stone beneath the palace shifted slightly, like the kingdom itself was adjusting to the return of its original center. Outside, the skies above the capital changed color in a way no one could explain. Snow that had been falling for days began to move differently, slower, heavier, as if gravity itself had become uncertain. Inside the forest far away, the woman stood frozen. She had not followed the events of the capital physically, but she had felt them. Every shift, every collapse, every return. The final wolf no longer stood in front of her as a mystery. It stood as something complete. Its eyes were calm now, but not empty. They carried the stillness of something that had already finished becoming what it was meant to be. The wolves around it no longer moved. They simply existed in alignment, as if the forest itself had accepted a new order without resistance. The healer finally spoke. His voice weak and broken. "It is over," but the woman did not answer, because something inside her refused to accept that word. Over meant ending, and what she was sensing did not feel like an ending. It felt like conclusion. In the capital, the Alpha King finally turned away from the throne, not because he rejected it, but because he no longer needed to question it. The advisors who had once controlled the false ruler now stood in complete silence. Some had already fallen to their knees without realizing it. Others simply stared, unable to process how quickly the structure of power had dissolved around them. The Alpha King moved forward through the hall. Each step did not demand obedience, it created it. The guards parted without instruction. The path opened without resistance. Not because fear controlled them, but because recognition had replaced confusion. Something inside them remembered what authority actually felt like, and everything false became unbearable in comparison. As he passed through the hall, fragments of the past began to settle into place within the kingdom's memory. Betrayal was no longer hidden. Lies no longer held structure. Every manipulation that had built the false regime began to collapse under its own exposure. But the Alpha King did not stop to punish anyone yet. His presence alone was enough to undo what had been constructed in his absence. Outside the palace gates, the city reacted in waves. People stepped into streets without understanding why they were drawn there. Something in the air had changed. Something that could not be explained, but could not be ignored. The return had become undeniable. Back in the forest, the woman finally stepped closer to the final wolf. Her hand moved slowly, not out of fear, but out of understanding that whatever stood before her was no longer uncertain. The moment her fingers touched its fur again, there was no shock this time. No overwhelming pulse, only recognition, not of the creature, but of the connection it carried. Her breath steadied slightly as she realized something that made her chest tighten in a different way. Had not just saved a life, she had anchored something that had been drifting between collapse and return. The final wolf closed its eyes, and in that moment, the distance between forest and capital disappeared completely in meaning. The Alpha King stood once more at the edge of the throne, and instead of sitting, he turned slightly toward the broken hall. His voice was not raised, it did not need to. Be the words carried without sound. Breaking the air. Every lie ends where presence begins. The false authority of the capital did not respond, it simply ceased, like a structure that had realized it was no longer supported. Back in the forest, the woman suddenly felt a shift so deep it forced her to take a step back. The final wolf's body began to dissolve its remaining uncertainty, not physically but in presence, as if everything it had carried between survival and identity had finally chosen one form. The healer whispered again. But this time there was no fear in his voice. It is not a return anymore. It is completion. The woman's eyes widened, slightly as she understood what that meant. The Alpha King was no longer divided between what he was and what he had become. He was now entirely himself, and that meant the world would no longer experience him as survival or struggle, only as truth. In the capital, the Alpha King reached the edge of the palace balcony overlooking the entire city. The wind moved around him, but did not touch him the same way it touched everything else. The world beneath him felt reorganized by presence alone. People looked up without being told, not out of fear, out of recognition they could not explain. The Alpha King stood at the highest point of the kingdom, and for the first time since his return, he allowed silence to stretch long enough for the entire world to feel it, fully. Then he spoke once more, not as command, but as final alignment. What was stolen returns to structure. What was false returns to nothing. And the kingdom, for the first time, understood what it had truly been waiting for. Not a ruler, but correction. In the forest, the woman finally lowered her hand, and the final wolf opened its eyes one last time. This time, there was no separation between what it had been and what it was, only clarity. The wind passed through the trees gently, as if the world had finally stopped resisting its own balance. And then, from the far distance, beyond forest, beyond capital, beyond every boundary the kingdom had known, a new sound began to form, not war, not celebration, but expansion, as if something had awakened not just within a kingdom, but within the world itself. The woman looked toward the horizon, her heart tightening again, because she realized something that had never been spoken aloud. The Alpha King's return was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of everything that came after it. And far away, where the throne had once stood in broken silence, the Alpha King turned slightly toward the open horizons, if sensing something beyond the kingdom itself had already begun to respond to his existence. Something larger, something waiting, and for the first time since returning, he did not look at what he had reclaimed.